One of the last duels fought on American soil occurred in 1877. The subject was Miss Edith May Randolph, who would become financier J.P. Morgan's mistress and then William Whitney's second wife. Let's learn more about this woman, potentially the real life inspiration behind the Gilded Age's Susan Blane, whom all of Gilded Age Newport was warned to avoid. Born in 1854, Edith Sibyl May came from a highly respected Baltimore and Washington D.C. family. Her father, Dr. John Frederick May, served as Lincoln's doctor at his death in 1865 and performed the autopsy on John Wilkes Booth. Dr. John Frederick May died at his residence, number 2022 G Street Northwest, in 1891. He was surrounded by his wife, his son, Dr. William May, and other members of his family, including his 6 children. The doctor had been ill for several weeks. An attack of grippe developed into pneumonia, which could have hardly ended otherwise than fatally. Dr. May, Edith's father, was perhaps the oldest resident of Washington, D.C. at the time of his death. He was born there in 1812, and though he spent time in Baltimore becoming what was considered the greatest of antebellum doctors, he spent practically his whole life in Washington, D.C. He was one of the most prominent citizens of the capital, distinguished as a physician, foremost in movements of enterprise and development, a leader in social life, and a gentleman of illustrious lineage and elegant culture. Dr. May was a conspicuous figure in Washington. He had a brilliant reputation in medicine and surgery, having been the first in this part of the world to perform successfully the operation of amputation at the hip. He was a student of Columbia College in 1831, graduated in medicine in 1834, completed his studies in Paris in 1837, where he attended the lectures of Valpo. It is possible his daughter Edith grew up speaking French to her father. He was professor of surgery at the University of Maryland at the age of 25 onwards. In 1841, he and the late Dr. Sewall reorganized the medical department of Columbia College, and he was professor of anatomy and surgery there. A contemporary of Doctors Hall and Johnson, he shared with them the first honors in general practice and was very excellent in the specialty of surgery. He was a man of commanding presence and of that powerful and impressive physique which is characteristic of the May family, perhaps a nod to Edith May in this obituary. His 2 brothers, Charles of the United States Army and George, accumulated a large fortune in New Orleans. They were both men of large frame and great muscular strength, as are also his sons William and Frederick, who moved to South America. Dr. May was one of President Lincoln's attending physicians at the time of the assassination, and by singular coincidence was called upon some days later to perform an autopsy on the corpse of the assassin. His son, Dr. William May, published a statement describing the event and giving the facts of his distinguished father's identification of Booth by means of a scar on the neck which he had personally treated years before. Dr. May left a widow, 2 sons, and 4 daughters, to whom will go his large estate. The remains are interred in Rock Creek Cemetery. Dr. William May, son of the deceased and himself a brilliant and successful physician, was the executor of the estate. May's funeral attracted old and distinguished capital families, but these families were considered very separate from those of New York City. However, Edith May had at least one strong New York City connection to help her in her social ascendance. Her cousin, Herman Ulrichs, born in 1850, dying in 1906, was an agent at Norddeutsche Lloyd Shipping. According to Horace Lafayette's book, Polo in the United States, A History, Ulrichs introduced the game of polo into the United States after his travels abroad. He was the man who brought the first mallets, polo balls, and shirts into the United States. At the age of 22 in 1876, potentially with her cousin's help, Edith May was engaged to the legendary owner of the New York Herald, Gordon Bennett. Considered so problematic his very name became an expletive in England, Bennett was 30 years Edith May's senior. He was born at 114 Chambers Street in New York City in 1841, but was brought up in Paris by his mother with his sister and a retinue of tutors and housemaids. He inherited the New York Herald, sponsored Stanley's trip to Africa to find Livingstone, and George W. DeLong's disastrous voyage to the North Pole. Bennett won the first transatlantic yachting race, fought one of the last duels in the United States over Edith May, helped introduce polo to the United States, was the youngest ever Commodore of the New York Yacht Club, co-founded the American Jockey Club, sponsored the Bennett Trophy in motor racing and the Tiffany Silver Bennett Cup for yachting. He established the Coupe Bennett hot air balloon race that is still held to this day, and built the Newport Casino, which you can spot in season 2 of HBO's Gilded Age. Eventually ostracized from New York society in 1877 for his scandalous behavior, Bennett worked closely with his father, and by 1867 was handed control of the New York Herald in addition to establishing the Evening Telegram. The Herald already enjoyed the highest circulation in the United States, and Bennett furthered its readership by establishing international editions in London and Paris, as well as co-founding the commercial cable company for sending transatlantic telegrams to get the news as fast as possible. He continued in his father's mold. The purpose of the news was not to educate, according to him, but to shock. You can learn more about newspapermen like Bennett in the videos on William Randolph Hearst on this channel. Bennett enjoyed racing through the streets in his four in hand, often in the middle of the night, wearing nothing but a white silk top hat. On one occasion, he nearly altered the course of world history when he lost control on a sharp corner, and his riding companion, Jennie Jerome, mother of Winston Churchill, was thrown from the carriage. With echoes of Woolworth, he was obsessed with the symbolism of owls that featured on every building and memorial he built, and such was the value he placed on his Pekingese dogs that for years he only hired people at the Herald to whom they showed affection, although one wily journo got around that hindrance by hiding veal on himself. In 1866, in the Henrietta, Bennett won the first transoceanic yacht race ever held, sailing from Sandy Hook, New Jersey to the Needles on the Isle of Wight in 13 days and 21 hours, 8 hours ahead of the runner-up. In 1883, he commissioned the most magnificent yacht of its day, Namuna, which was painted by various Italian artists, on which he kept a cow so that he could always have fresh cream, and today's Americans can't even buy raw milk. In 1876, Bennett was frequently seen out with Edith May, and after they attended Lord Dufferin's ball in Toronto, it was considered only a matter of time before their engagement was formally announced. When a bridal trousseau had been seen to arrive for Edith from Paris, it was practically sealed, signed, and delivered. But instead of wedding bells, rumors began to spread about various wild escapades involving Bennett. The rumors were quickly followed by the news that the engagement had been broken. It transpired that Bennett had turned up both late and drunk to a party hosted by his would-be in-laws, the Mays, and ended up urinating in a fireplace or a grand piano, depending on who you asked, in full view of all the other guests. Outraged, a few days later, Edith's highly chivalrous brother, Frederick, set off to the Union Club on Fifth Avenue with a cowhide whip in hand, intent on whipping Bennett in public. When Bennett finally appeared, May set upon him, and Bennett was assaulted, beaten, and thrown down. Humiliated in retaliation, though contrary to the accepted code of honor perhaps leading to his social downfall, Bennett issued May a challenge to a duel that was accepted. The following day, in January 1877, the parties met at Meridel on the Maryland-Delaware boundary line, although some sources state they met in Arizona, which is impossible. for the time of travel. It was reported that both men fired 3 shots from their pistols at 20 paces, at which point their seconds, clearly more terrified than the duelists, stepped in and drew the affair to a close without one drop of blood being spilled. The 2 men then reconvened to the local Dover hotel, since demolished, ordered beer together, and eventually shook hands. And so ended the duel fought over Miss Edith May. Nevertheless, Bennett remained terrified of Edith's 6 foot 1 inch tall brother for the rest of his life. Years later, when undressing in front of a showgirl, he sheepishly revealed a chain mail undershirt, admitting he'd heard Fred May was back in France. Fred never married, perhaps holding Edith close in his affections. He did have a temper and killed a New York City policeman during an argument and then fled to South America. But Edith was in a tough spot after the duel. Was the duel considered a huge social faux pas, and why Bennett was dropped from New York society after it? It seems so, because Edith May traveled to England the year after. In 1878, Edith May became the second wife of an English landowner, Major Arthur Randolph, who was 15 years her senior, and he died just 7 years after their wedding. Major Randolph had a daughter from his first marriage who married into nobility, and so Edith May was regularly reminded of the strict social order in which she had to fight her way upward. She returned to the United States and decided to settle in Bar Harbor, not Newport as the Gilded Age shows, perhaps with some of her father's estate from 1891, as well as some of her first husband's property. Bar Harbor, Maine, in its Gilded Age heyday, was a place where the moneyed class could fool around without the prying eyes of New York or Washington, D.C. Young couples enjoyed it as well, which you can learn about in the Edith Wharton video on this channel. In 1893, William Whitney and J.P. Morgan were taking full advantage of the summer resort's freewheeling atmosphere, and they found themselves fighting for the same woman, Miss Edith May Randolph. They weren't the first by any means. Willie K. Vanderbilt sulked in his yacht off the coast of Bar Harbor after his divorce made front-page news. Joseph Pulitzer hid in a soundproof tower at his Bar Harbor estate, unable to bear the slightest noise. And J.P. Morgan stashed his mistresses on Bar Harbor's High Street in between his pious visits to St. Saviour's Episcopal Church. J.P. Morgan was the most powerful financier of his day and probably would have been the richest if he hadn't spent so much money on his spectacular art collection, 20,000 pieces accumulated in 23 years, many of which you can spot at the Athenaeum of Hartford, Connecticut, which I highly recommend. The name of Morgan's game was acquisition. Why have a dozen highly skilled little businesses when you could have just one? This economic model relied heavily upon motivated, skilled American labor, but would result in too big to fail nonsense and a total shutout of the entrepreneur from the workplace by the 21st century. Morgan had a nose that looked like a purple cauliflower due to rosacea, which exacerbated his social awkwardness, but it didn't hurt him with the ladies, who he liked a lot. They liked him too, and they were more than willing to look past his facial deformity. Morgan's second wife, Frances Louise Tracy, whom he had married in 1865, by and large tolerated her husband's infidelities. The first Mrs. Morgan died after only 4 months of marriage after suffering from tuberculosis, which severely impacted Morgan. Morgan made it easier for his second wife by keeping a continent between them for his affairs. When he went to Europe, where he eventually died, she stayed in the United States and vice versa. But there was one woman she couldn't tolerate, Edith May Randolph. A newspaper described Edith May Randolph as one of the leaders in the smart set, popular, and a great favorite among the diplomatic circles. Her family was noted for their chivalry and military tradition. A beautiful widow in her 30s with no children of her own, she had family connections to the 400, New York social elite. Mrs. Morgan told Morgan, whom she called Pierpont, to drop the widow. Spoke to P about Mrs. R, she wrote in her diary in 1894. Was she worried about another duel? And was Mrs. R already taken? Edith May Randolph had already attracted the attention of someone else in her social set, the smart, charming, and very married William Whitney. Whitney's career got a boost from his best friend Oliver Hazard Payne. They roomed together at Yale and joined the Skull and Bones. Whitney was rich with a family fortune in steamships, but Payne was really rich with a family fortune in tobacco, steel, and oil. When William Whitney married Oliver Payne's beloved sister Flora, who was close friends with First Lady Cleveland, Payne bought them a New York City mansion as a wedding present, designed by Stanford White himself. You can learn more about the ghosts around the Stanford White murder in the Ghosts of Lyndhurst video on this channel. William Whitney's charm, brains, and brother-in-law propelled him to a successful career as a lawyer, financier, and politician. When President Grover Cleveland named him Secretary of the Navy in 1885, rumor had it that Oliver Payne paid a bribe to get his brother-in-law the job, despite Whitney's long history of naval service. During his 4 years as Secretary of the Navy, Flora and William Whitney dominated Washington, D.C.'s social scene with an estimated 60,000 or 600,000 guests, depending on who you ask, visiting their home. And when Whitney sailed into Bar Harbor, crowds came out to greet him. Newspapers touted him as a potential candidate for President of the United States. But William Whitney had a roving eye, and in 1890 his eye roved towards Edith May Randolph. Oliver Payne got wind that his brother-in-law was straying from his beloved sister Flora, perhaps from Flora herself. He told his brother-in-law in no uncertain terms to stay away from the widow, who had not yet come into her father's estate. Whitney complied. Then in 1893, Flora Payne Whitney died suddenly at the age of 51 after watching her daughter Pauline come out into society. William Whitney went into mourning for 2 years. Edith May then insinuated herself into Morgan's circle, even accompanying the family to his son's funeral. But generally Morgan kept the Atlantic Ocean between Edith and his wife. One August day in 1895, William Whitney sailed his yacht Columbia to Bar Harbor, where both Edith May Randolph and J.P. Morgan were summering. Morgan invited Whitney and the widow onto his yacht, the Corsair. Mrs. Morgan had already made it clear about how she felt about Edith May, so by the end of the summer idyll, William Whitney and Edith May Randolph were an item. Edith May boarded as Morgan's mistress for a sail around the Maine coast. She disembarked as Whitney's paramour. A year later, in 1896, Whitney and Edith May married in St. Saviour's. None of the 4 Whitney children attended the wedding, which newspapers gossiped about. Pauline Whitney said she was traveling through Europe and couldn't make the wedding. One gossip columnist reported, with some snark, that he was surprised to see Mr. and Mrs. Morgan not on the guest list. Oliver Hazard Payne did not attend the wedding either. William Whitney so infuriated his former brother-in-law that Payne threatened to ruin him. He went to Whitney's children and demanded they choose between him and their father after the wedding. 2, Harry and Dorothy, who was just a child at the time, chose their father. 2, William and Pauline, chose Uncle Oliver. William chose Uncle Oliver to such an extent he changed his name. Harry and Dorothy didn't suffer from want. Harry inherited $24 million from his father and $12 million from Uncle Oliver. But William, who started going by his middle name Payne, did much better. He inherited $63 million from his uncle and $25 million from his father. When he died, he bequeathed part of his $100 million plus fortune to the world-famous Payne Whitney Psychiatric Clinic of Manhattan, as well as other New York hospitals. A trustee of the New York Public Library, in 1923, Payne gave the library $12 million. Whitney made charitable contributions to the rowing team at his alma mater, Yale, including donating funds to build a dormitory for the crew. So we see the strong sense of noblesse oblige among American Gilded Age families extending into the 20th and 21st centuries. William Whitney and Edith May Randolph may have had a happy marriage, but it didn't last long. In Edith May, Whitney found a woman of Washington, D.C., a woman who had married a veteran, and he remembered that the city of Washington, D.C. had treated him like a hero. Both were avid equestrians, and William Whitney invested heavily in thoroughbred horse racing. One day in 1898, Edith May was horseback riding in a fox hunt in Aiken, South Carolina, known as horse country, when she misjudged the height of a low stone bridge. When her horse galloped the bridge, she struck her head and fell from the horse. The accident left her paralyzed below the neck. After a 15-month struggle, she died in May 1899, aged 41, apparently after an attempted appendicitis operation, the timing of which is suspect. Her obituary read she died riding to hounds, an active descriptor of the woman who inspired so much tragic romance. 3 years after his second wife's death, in January 1901, at his residence at 871 Fifth Avenue, Whitney gave a debutante ball for his niece, Helen Barney. He remained active in horse racing and largely made Saratoga Racetrack what it is today. He remained active in street railway affairs until the reorganization of the Metropolitan Street Railway Company in 1902. At that time, he retired from all personal identification with the company in an apparent personal dispute. William Whitney died in 1904 at the age of 61. While he could have remarried, he did not. Rumors circulated that Oliver Payne killed him, perhaps convinced that Whitney had exacerbated the death of his beloved sister Flora for Edith May.